Glory to Jesus Christ, glory forever. Hey, this is Father Anthony. Let's talk vocations. Today we're blessed. If you're watching, you can see him there, Dr. George Stavros. And you are a professor of, I'm telling you, you know this, you're a professor of clinical psychology at Boston University and also the executive director of the Albert and Jessie Danielson Institute there. Fantastic. So I was in Rhode Island for several years. So we
Oh, okay.
were neighbors. Yeah.
Oh, where in Rhode Island were you?
I was assigned to Woonsocket.
Uh-huh.
So it's up on the northern part. We were a mile from Massachusetts. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. Well, fantastic. So I love your article. That's what we're talking about. That's where we're going to get our conversation started about anyways. You wrote an article that's in Public Orthodoxy called Eastern Orthodox Clergy, an At-Risk Population. And I love it. That's one of the themes that we have is, challenges that priests face and what we can do to help them out. And also for seminarians, advice that we can get, and people who are considering vocations to kind of get them started right. So, doctor or professor, what do you prefer?
Please call me George.
George, okay. Just don't call you late for dinner.
Exactly.
All right, George. So what prompted you to write the article?
So that article comes from, there are a couple reasons that article appeared. The most simple and direct is because one of the editors of Public Orthodoxy, Telly Papanikolaou, and I are classmates from seminary.
Oh.
And so, we stay in touch. And he knew that at the Danielson Institute, we were doing some research on clergy wellness and had been for quite some time, including some research specifically on Greek Orthodox clergy and clergy families. And so he'd been on me for close to a year, saying, come on, we need that article. And finally, it managed to come together, and that's where it came from. So
I love that, because what I'm hearing is, all right, so you're coming at it from maybe three directions at least. One is as, a theologian, someone who thinks about issues of religion and practices it, but also as, pastoral psychologist, right?
Mm-hmm.
And as a social scientist. You've got data.
We do. We do have data.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'm not, I don't know if I can call myself a social scientist yet. I was ABD for a while, and now I'm back starting the process over in political science. So,
good. Yeah, I noticed that. That's great. Good luck. Much strength to you as you get over that set of hurdles. It's no small thing.
Well, there's a bit of hazing involved. I'm in my fourth statistics class, and it's the final one. And if I make it through it, it's a sign of grace.
I hear you. I'm surrounded, thank goodness, by a lot of people who are really good at statistics, because I'm not.
Right, and that's the way it is. We all have different gifts. That's a constant theme in this show, and we shouldn't feel guilty about things that we can't do well if there are other people who have that gift, right? So, all right, so let's get into the article, and I want to take it backwards, and you can adjust this if you want, because you kind of went from the outside in. And I'd like to start with kind of the constitution of the priest. You talk about factors, risk factors for the priest that make the priest endangered, right? Mm-hmm. And one of them is kind of their sense of self and their self-knowledge, right? And the section is called Narcissism as a Risk Factor, but it's broader than narcissism as I read it. So what is that risk? And then we can talk about how to gain the kind of knowledge that'll bring us away, mitigate that risk.
Mm-hmm. So do you want to start with some of the internal risk factors?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, the article's very succinct. And so, it paints with broad brushstrokes. Yep. But the basic idea is, and this isn't like shocking from a psychological perspective or spiritual perspective, it basically wants to recognize that our developmental histories, the ways in which we have moved through the world from infancy, you could even say in utero, through development, through infancy and toddlerhood and early childhood and adolescence and into early adulthood, all the way through life, that there's a developmental process occurring. And there are certain things that, from a psychological perspective, a developmental perspective, there are certain things that are just really important that have to be in place in order for our inner architecture, our inner relational capacities and expectations and resilience to have a chance to take root and build up and grow. That's the basic idea. That and we can go into more or less detail about what some of those things are, but that part of the article really is saying, hey, each of us has been on a journey developmentally and relationally, and part of being whole, part of being healthy, is to have some awareness of what that journey has been like for us, what it has meant, what particular relationships have had impacts on us, and how it influences the way that we now move in the world, what our expectations are. Is it a trustworthy world? Is it a scary world? Is it a world where I have to be very defended because I can't really count on what's being told to me? Is it a world in which I feel like I've got within me a certain amount of sturdiness to deal with whatever comes? Those Answering those questions from a psychological perspective has a lot to do with that inner architecture, that what's gotten built up in us over time through relationships. So that's the basic idea.
Right, yeah, beautiful. So, and how are we doing? So, my seminary experience was not normal. I was a late vocations and I did a distance program. So, you wouldn't expect a whole lot of that kind of guided introspection, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I had to pick it up in other places, and thank God I have. And one of them, by the way, is through chaplaincy training. They're
Yes.
very intentional about putting you through that. And then also with the VA, I'm a veteran, and they have very good services. If you ever want to
Yes.
talk about stuff, and I've benefited from that so much that as a seminary professor and as a former vocations director, we brought that in. Not as well developed. It's kind of ad hoc. Just these are things that I found useful, and I'd give them to them, and it'd begin a conversation, right? And and the idea there is I'm not trying to fix anything. I'm beginning to help them with their quest of self-knowledge, self-understanding, so that they could just figure out why it is they react to things the way that they do, right? So when you look around and you look through the data, how are we doing? Is this something that is on, the priestly radar?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say that it's on the radar of some some of our clergy and clergy spouses and families, just I'd say more naturally are open to that awareness and that exploration. I would say others go down that road, and I would consider myself not in the sense of being clergy, but in the sense of going into seminary and starting this path for myself in seminary. Came to it because I started to realize I was not as solid and steady in my inner life as I wanted to be or as I thought I was. And so it moving into that process was something that was precipitated by some pain and losing my way. So I'd say some clergy and clergy spouses come to it that way. And then I think it's not a large portion, but I think there's some tension at times or some antagonism between psychology broadly defined and theology, and some mistrust bred between them as disciplines, as if they don't emanate from a similar place. And I think in those cases there can be almost like a resistance to that kind of a journey or that exploration, and that may have to do with the culture, theological culture one is raised in, But it can also be a result of there being early trauma or painful relationships that make it so, people just don't want to go there. And so there can be some avoidance of it. And I would say that's probably the place where there's the most vulnerability, the most at riskness is in that place where there is existing developmental relational trauma or neglect or abandonment, and it's left its mark in ways. But the way that that's being dealt with is to somehow set it aside and not go on the journey into healing it.
Yeah, yeah. This is one of those real difficulties, pastoral difficulties, because you do encounter people like that. But if you don't have a relationship of trust, then you're not going to be able to get any leverage to help them. And there's a sense of denial, right? So you've got a whole mess of stuff. Lord willing, I'm going to talk with Adam DeVille. He wrote an article for Commonweal recently on this topic about how there's a hesitancy to even accept the idea of self-care in some subcultures of Christianity and certainly of clergy, right? We accept the idea of a spiritual fatherhood, right? But that isn't necessarily the same thing. It depends on the spiritual father, the expectations, and as you pointed out, if you're coming at that and your lens on fatherhood is distorted by early traumas or whatever, then your expectations are not going to be the kinds that are going to lead to a healthy relationship that'll lead to the healing and the self-knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's hard. So one of the things, the little, we have a saying in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the USA that priests need priests, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the idea there is you need to have people that you can trust, that you can just open up to, that you can be vulnerable to, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's hard, especially hard for people that's the stumbling block, right? Is not allowing yourself to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
So how do you crack that nut? and it may be, if somebody's 60 years old, maybe it's too far, right? But when we're dealing with vocations and we're dealing with seminarians and young priests, how can we maybe help?
Yeah. Well, I think you've mentioned this a couple times already. The whole idea of trust is the heart of it, because human beings just aren't built to learn from people that they don't trust, at least not the deepest lessons about life and love and self-sacrifice and self-emptying and being outward facing. There's no way to learn those lessons and how to be that way skillfully and in a healthy way without trusting relationships. It just can't happen. So I would understand part of the issue is there has to be some structure, some rhythm, some expectation, and some availability of trusting relational processes that obviously start with who the people are in the relationship, but the context within which trusting healing relationships take place is vital. If it's in a seminary, then the seminary itself, the leadership of the seminary, the hierarchical oversight of the leadership of the seminary, people have to at least be close to being on the same page that there's value in doing the hard psycho-spiritual work of growing and healing from the inevitable impacts of, you could say, developing in a fallen world where everybody gets injured at some level, not always traumatically, but that institutional buy-in's got to be from the top down, because otherwise it's like people who want to do this work end up doing it quietly, doing it on the side, doing it adjunctively, almost hiding it from the mainstream life of the institution. And that in and of itself is sending a message. It's sending a message that kind of work somehow is shameful or it's secondary. And if you can just preach and chant and do the liturgy and understand dogmatic theology, then you actually don't really need that stuff. You're going to be a center cut, fully formed and healthy clergy person. And I don't think that's the way to approach it. I think if there's a way to make relational, psycho-spiritual healing center cut along with every other thing that a clergyman's got to learn along the way, then it's got a much better chance not only of making a difference in their life and making them less at risk as they go out into the parish, but it's going to change the way that they minister. It's going to change their whole pastoral way of being. And not everybody, I'm not saying everybody's got to go in and become a pastoral psychologist or have great counseling skills. I'm not saying that. But at the most basic level of developing trusting relationships, of maintaining a basic sense of non-reactivity, or at least minimal reactivity to conflict and to other people's pain, to being able to stay in one's chair when the heat gets turned up. That comes from healing. That comes from being in a healed place. And so therefore, I think it would pay dividends across the board if our clergy were formed in settings that made their own development and their own formation and healing central, along with everything else they have to do. I think it would pay huge dividends.
Yeah, and it seems so obvious, right? You if you're going to send out doctors, heal them, teach them how to heal. But it could be the case that seminaries themselves attract. You could imagine, and we've read about seminaries where it was just off the rails, where openness and vulnerability was rewarded with manipulation, right? And so then you just get the added level of trauma and all kinds of additional mess that would need to be untangled. And so you really do have to have eyes on the culture of the seminary. And
Mm-hmm.
anyways, because
Mm-hmm.
it is a magnet, not just seminary, but any kind of position where people are going to be vulnerable. It's a magnet for manipulators, for narcissists, and we, the church, have to protect the vulnerable from that, right? Yeah. So this is the second point of your, as you say, it's a short essay, but it's really strong. Relational aggression as a risk factor, right? And you've got this wonderful quote from St. John Chrysostom: "For all who surround him are ready to smite and overthrow him, not only his enemies and foes, but many of those who pretend to love him." Right? What does that do to a priest?
Well, it's interesting. I hadn't gone back to on the priesthood the 6 books since seminary. I don't think, or maybe right after seminary. So we're talking almost 30 years ago. And when I started to sit down to put some ideas together for the essay, I thought, let me take a look and see if there's anything in there. And it literally was one thing after another. His awareness, and it was when he was, battling within himself whether to take the step and allow his being ordained. He was so aware of what some of the pitfalls were, and he put right out there up front this thing that there will be people. Now, this isn't to say all people, because every clergy person and family member that I've spoken to have shared how some of the best people they've ever met in their lives have been there for them in that context as parishioners or friends, or really stepped up for them. So it's not to say that this is always the case with everyone. However, it is very, very common that in any pastoral situation, there will be at least a few people who will target the priest and his family with expectations that are unrealistic, with unmet needs that they seek to have met by the priest or the family, with unprocessed grief or aggression that they may not even be aware that they're playing out. And sometimes it goes to a whole nother level of almost sadistic cruelty towards the priest and the priest's family. And, we can think about all kinds of reasons for this, but in each of these cases, it's important, I think, for the priest to realize that who they are in their role represents such an evocative combination of things for many, if not most people, including God, God's representative, Christ on earth, saints, fathers, older brothers, leaders, all these very powerful and power-laden relationships that people have that sometimes have been met in a trusting way, but for many people have represented betrayals of trust or mistreatment, get loaded up on the shoulders of the priest. And there's no way to even know with each person the priest encounters what it is, what the expectations are that person has for them. I think they can start to feel it in their bones at times, like, what are they talking? That's not me they're relating to. But that's all part of being aware that it's an inescapable part of being a priest. Is there's just so much loaded up there that that's something they have to learn to deal with and carry.
Yeah, the person who trained me in chaplaincy, she would say, yeah, there are a lot of people in the room. and learning to identify who those people are and how they're affecting the conversations really, really important. So, yeah, and this goes back to that original point. If the priest knows and is comfortable with himself, his relationship with Christ, is secure, then it's more likely that it won't be as reactive, the boundaries will be maintained, but that's not automatic. In fact, it takes a lot of work for many of us to get to that point. And what you're more likely to see, I think, depending, this is going to vary a lot, but many of our clergy, they're high on the likability scale, on the Big Five, right? So, they can fall into that trend of people pleasing, right? So you get in there and someone has unrealistic expectations. Well, all you know is that you're supposed to be sacrificially Christ to those people, right? And then the next thing you know, you're just in this crazy place, right? That's not sustainable. And the alternative, doesn't seem Christian. So what kind of advice do you give a priest in that sort of situation?
Well, first of all, I think to try to manage that on one's own in some sort of isolated, singular way is impossible. To discern all that you just described inside one's own head, or even inside one's own contemplative life, this may be hyperbolic, but I'm going to say it anyway. It's impossible. So first things first, that person, the priest, has to be in relationship with peers and senior mentor peers. I'm using psychology, lay words, but has to have spiritual brothers and sisters and fathers and mothers to whom they can bring these sorts of considerations and talk them through and absorb what they've taken into a community of healers. It's, I think about the training that other healing professions have to go through in order to get to a point where they are released, so to speak, to provide independent practice, which I would argue is never a good idea, no matter how senior someone in the healing professions is. They should always be part of the healing community one way or another. But I worry, the basic training model for priests in the United States, especially Eastern Orthodox priests, is many get put into almost an outpost situation where they don't have access to regular, sophisticated consultation with peers and mentors that help them to figure out how to move through these treacherous waters. So that's the first thing I would say, is just change the structures so that's That's not just hoped for, that's expected.
Yeah, beautiful. And we're this ideally this would be something that was already set up, right? It would be already well established. And I see people doing it in pockets, right? There was this program that I had some friends in eastern Pennsylvania where they were having these, clergy groups that would meet, and it was very intentional, and all of them really benefited from it. But it doesn't take something that structured. What it takes is us checking in on each other regularly. And then, as the older person in most of those dialogues, I show them how vulnerability looks, right? I say, look, here's what I'm struggling with. And I tell you what, there's still stuff I don't get. I'm way off, right? So one of my friends, I took him this problem. It was like the communication was way off. It was like different languages. And I'm trying to figure out what the question behind the question is, and I'm continually getting it wrong. And one of my spiritual mentors, he said, sometimes a question is just a question. Answer the question and see what happens. And here I had spent all this time, praying and thinking and trying to do all the math, right? Get out of your way, right? Anyway, the point is that, yeah, it's so good having this network. And take the ego out of it. You're not there to impress anybody. That's the part of vulnerability. Be open. It's okay. Everybody's got blind spots, right? Just we just have to do a better job. So I don't know if this is true or if it's just one of those folk wisdom things, but therapists have to be in therapy, right? That's just part of the deal.
Yeah.
I guess formally, everyone who does confessions, they take confession. But priests really for one, they have to go out of the way to do confession. And for another, confession isn't always the best vehicle for this kind of conversation. Yeah.
Right. Well, I think if one is going to be a technician, and speaking from a therapeutic perspective, if one is going to be a technician and simply utilize super structured, super manualized ways of providing care that don't recognize the importance of the relational things that happen. It's more like exposure exercises to mitigate fear of spiders or fear of heights or to diminish panic attacks. One could make the argument that all you need is the technical knowledge to do that. I imagine one might be able to make a similar argument if all you're going to do is, I don't mean to say all. If what you're going to do is administer the sacraments and be proficient technically with music and with knowledge of prayers, then maybe you don't need this kind of network. But everything that I've come across that's made the most sense to me from a mental health perspective in terms of the care is whatever the technique is, in the end, it's secondary to it being delivered in a relationally secure, trusting way. That the relationship is the vehicle for whatever is going to happen. Now, what needs to happen is always different, but without the vehicle, and we can't be reliable vehicles to deliver healing unless we know very intimately and personally what it's like to be broken and to heal.
Yeah, I love that point about the technician part. And I think I hear what you're saying. So, but I try to imagine what that would look like. And it would be a very minimal sort of priesthood, because not just confessions, like I've heard there are traditions where priests are not given a blessing, to hear confessions until they've reached a certain state of maturity and trust, right? But, if you're not healthy and if you're not aware of your own infirmities, right, then it's going to affect not just how you confess people, it's going to affect how you preach, right? So it's not going to affect the validity of the sacraments, right? Okay, that's one of the first things we learn, is that, it's not, if it had to be based on my holiness, sorry guys, yeah, Typica again this week. Right, so I think that even to be a technician, yeah, I just can't imagine a situation, because eventually you are going to be called to do something pastoral, something that involves, creativity. And I mean that hopefully in the Orthodox sense, creativity where you're applying this knowledge to a certain circumstance. So yeah, this is something that we really need to do. And when, advice that I give younger priests, younger, seminarians is, look, you don't have to be the spiritual elder. There's a saying for that in Russian, mladostarosti, if someone who's young tries to put on all that, right? Just get out of the way of the sacrament, listen to them. Very basic advice if you're, maybe. And then the prayer of absolution, right?
Yeah.
It's not only is it not necessary, it can be in the way. So anyways, that's just my opinion, and good people disagree. So you talked a bit about the first one, the pastoral role as a risk factor. That's is the first point you make, and you started with this broad look. These guys, they're out there, and it's like being a doctor in a hospital where there's all kinds of different diseases. Of course, you're going to be at risk, right? And that's true. If you're in a parish of 100 people, right? How many different infirmities and how many different ways have people's histories affected them, right? It's huge.
Huge. I don't think, well, I'm not aware of a more apt time to think about it that way. We're so aware of the risks of infection and everything right now with the coronavirus. But the role that a pastor has within a community is to be exposed in flashpoints that, depending on the size and the nature of the community, can be pretty regular and intense, of people coming at hugely important transitional times in life, times when they've been exposed to some sort of traumatic event, or deep grief or loss, or difficult life circumstances that they can't figure out. And in those kinds of situations, people aren't always going to say, well, who would the best person be to go to here? Who would have the most expertise for me? If they're people who have a kind of baseline trust in the church and in the priest, there's a good chance if they don't start with the priest, they're at least going to include the priest in seeking out help and relief from this. And so that means the role itself is going to expose priests to such a wide range of physical, mental, emotional, spiritual crises, growth opportunities, circumstances. They're going to be exposed to the whole world in their role. And there's no way to be prepared, nor should it ever be expected that the priest be prepared to be an expert in dealing with those things. But they should become highly skilled at discerning what needs to happen for somebody who's bringing an issue for which they are not an expert. And that doesn't mean just passing them off. It means, what can I, as the priest, offer here in terms of contact, support, love, spiritual containment? And what do I have developed around me that I can make suggestions to them? Or can I just say, I really don't know what should happen next, but I want you to know I'm with you as you figure that out, and to not abandon and not retaliate is the idea.
Yeah, fantastic. So if I could pull you out a little bit more on that, and then we can talk about this coronavirus and how we can help people, both priests and the people they serve. as they recover from this, and so this is one of the great, it's not a dilemma, it's just a challenge, right? What am I competent at? When somebody comes and they're dealing with something, right? And here I don't mean, it's Sunday, it's the first Sunday of the month, therefore it's time for me to go to confession. That's not what I mean. I mean when someone is struggling with, divorce or heartbreak or grief or any number of things. They're finally dealing with a trauma that they had 15 years ago. One of the things that we're told is you're not a psychologist, you're not a psychiatrist, you're not a therapist, you don't have the skills. Be careful, right? Don't go, describing things as depression or, whatever. And I have met priests, and I've been, working with this, right? It can make you too conservative. In the sense of unwilling to offer something that you may be competent at. So what is that? What can, because you've seen it both sides, right? What is it that the priest can kind of relax in the competency of the priesthood and of his formation? And then where does that start to get into dark gray?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, since I'm not talking about a specific thing here, I want to be careful not to generalize this to every situation. But I think it's safe to say, in general, the priest can offer a kind of presence that is representative of deep love, unrelenting love. Not that the priest has to be unrelentingly loving. I'm not saying that, because that could fall into that, like, oh, I got to keep giving and giving, giving. I'm not saying that. I think it's more the awareness that whatever the priest does, if it's 2 minutes of contact, the priest still is a representative of God's love, God's presence, the reality of there not being anywhere that human beings can go or take themselves where God can't be present too, and to, in a sense, just hang in there with the person. And if it's too much, let's say if it's loaded up too much with mental health complexity for the priest to feel competent to take care of it, deal with it on their own, it's just to represent, here we are here, and this is part of your home and your healing. Now, what else do you need? What else are you doing? How else are you getting help with this? It's something about just hanging in there with the person in whatever small or larger way makes sense. I think that may be the most important thing.
George, that's beautiful. Yeah, because, sometimes we can be egoists, right? And think that, I am Christ to this person in this moment, right? Well, yeah, but there's a bigger Christ out there that you're really just kind of an entree into, or part of the introduction of them to Christ. You're not really the sum of Christ to that person, right? You don't have to figure it out. Christ is there. The Holy Spirit is present in all things, right? Just get out of the way again. Just give them some love, some support, some words, encouragement. Yeah. That's fantastic. So this has been a tough year for all of us, right? And when we hit the kind of challenges that we've been through with the coronavirus, and everybody experiences it differently, and we're so polarized that there are almost two types of experience of the COVID, right? There's a liberal response and there's a conservative response, right? But neither one of them is particularly enjoyable, right? They're both. Blah. And the way that we would usually respond to something when we're going through this is more church, more prayer, more sacramental, activity. And that very thing, even to the extent we're able to get access to the sacraments, it's without the fullness of the community that we're used to, right? Mm-hmm. And and it's, caused people to question some of the fundamental things about our faith, right? When people start arguing about communion and the spoon, the big concern is that they're talking about, things of profound significance, right? And that's true for both conservatives and liberals, right? And the experiences, the words are different, but the profundity is, it's deeply, real, ontological. And the church needs to be the place where people heal from this, right? At the very same time when the church itself has been objectified, right? So how is that going to work? How can we heal?
Hmm. So I don't have an answer to that. Let me just share a thought or two that I had as you were framing that. One, and this is in no way to diminish anything that we are going through right now. There have been so many deaths, so much suffering, so much economic fallout. It's a global situation affecting different parts of the globe more, but everybody knows about it and is aware of it and is responding to it. It's to think that we have to. So this is you're talking to a layman now. So take this with a layman, shrinky kind of guy. So take it with a grain of salt. But to think that we have to attach sacramental life, which we cannot live without, the life of God, loving us through our bodies, through our physical beings right here on earth. To think we can do without that is unfathomable to me. But to think that it has to be right now under these circumstances defined in ways that are conventional and like we have to fight quickly to get back to specific ways of whether it's a spoon or a stole on top of the head, very close or whatever it is. Right now in those ways, to have it be sacramental expressions of God's loving and healing us, that seems so hard right now. That puts added pressure on people to feel separate from their deepest connection to their Creator, who loves them under every condition. My guess is there have been times just as bad in human history and worse than this, especially for Orthodox Christians, when they couldn't get access to any of that. And yet, did that separate them from a sacramental experience of God's love and healing? So what do we do right now under strange conditions? I'm not sure, but I think it's got something to do with creativity, flexibility, attempting to balance joy and sorrow, making sure we're looking out for the people who are most getting pushed to loneliness and the margins in this, bringing all the wisdom of the church around things like grief and disconnection and the way that lives in the iconography and the hymns and the rhythms of prayer, and just trying to be creative with it so that new stuff pops up now that maybe lives on amidst all the good old stuff. But I feel like getting trapped in the forms right now is actually dangerous because it risks excluding a lot of people who are just afraid to approach the norms of church life.
Yeah, this is a big challenge, right? Where we misdiagnose risk aversion and fear for a lack of faith,
Oh,
right? And
that's so well said. Yeah,
it's we can do a lot of damage to people. So when you read St. Paul and he talks about being patient with one another, let the strong bear the burdens of the weak. All these things, teach us to be charitable about the intentions of others and so on. We have to hold some things lightly and reevaluate their applicability. 2 years ago, if I was teaching yeah, of course everyone should come to communion every time it's offered, right? And it was always an interesting thing because we get seminarians from Ukraine where that's not a part of the culture, and acculturating them to this American norm, American Orthodox norm. And some people would say, no, it's the Orthodox norm. Okay, whatever it is, we had to acculturate them to it. And we had to say, look, I know this is what you've been taught, but this is the way we're going to do it, and so on. And there's all this theology that you can turn into black and white and then misapply it now. And just hold that stuff lightly. This is not the time to be playing, dogmatizing things that are meant to be pastoral. That's a not just a misuse. It's I don't know. It's almost blasphemous, right? It's using something that is good and holy against the healing of the person, and it hurts. It hurts when you see, and it hurts when you see people. Because the people who are going through this, that's in their mind too. Is this a lack of, they're having crisis of faith that's tied up in that. The loneliness, the separation from the sacraments, all of this, and then the fear. And so the reaction has to be love. It has to be support, and it has to get the judgment taken out of it. And we can get back. I think we'll get back to where we were. But if it takes 5 years of infrequent communion, how many generations created saints with people taking communion once a year? Is it ideal? No, that's not what we're saying. We're not in the ideal world right now. We're in a world that's just been through this COVID thing, right? And it's going to take some time for us to adjust. And this creativity that you're speaking to, one of the benefits just to our family, right? Because I don't take my family to church every week. The numbers are reduced and the places are small, and we take care of my mom, so we have to be very kind of careful. Mm-hmm. And so they're praying together, taking turns on all the typical prayers and so on, and talking about the gospel. And there's a depth to that experience, and it's not a replacement for liturgy, but there's that's this creativity that you're speaking to, that you don't want to lose. You're like, hey, we really this is kind of nice, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh my goodness, but it's I do encourage everyone to just be patient with each other as we come out of this, and it's made worse by our political polarization. That's kind of my thing as a researcher, is looking at how polarization affects not just our attitudes towards each other, but affects our the way that we understand rituals and religious rituals and so on. And it's real, and if you don't have that kind of intentional introspection, you don't even notice how much it's affecting your evaluation of the other. Right?
Mm-hmm. Well, I can imagine that your community experiencing you as not getting pulled one way or the other, holding things lightly and holding people gently, and not having the narrative or the dialogue internally for people or between people go towards judgment, but have it be towards love. That what that represents for a community that's in crisis because of the pandemic, I think is exactly what a community needs, because they're as a community, are as vulnerable as they're going to be, are going to be as susceptible to polarization as they're ever going to be. And so it kind of goes back to that idea of accurate self-awareness and being outward facing and regulating one's emotions that go with that social science definition of humility. But it's not absent from a theological understanding of humility. You standing in place in a humble, open way, I think, because you do the work that's necessary to do that, because you receive God's love that enables you to stand steady, that goes out to a whole community. That's the power of the priesthood. is all that authority that's invested in our priests. That's where, like, there's exponential possibility of healing by staying in place that way.
Yeah, fantastic, George. Yeah, that's wonderful. And if we can get there, right? Which, yeah, if we could get there, then it's not about being able to do the math, right? It's just being, real, being in Christ, and just like you said, then you can become an icon of something that is just completely ontological, right?
Yes.
And that's I believe that is the answer, not just for priests, right? This is all of us. This is how we can do it. This is how we can fulfill our function as royal priests, as the royal priesthood, as stewards of creation. We're not going to figure out. Look, back in March, trying to look at the data and stuff, you're going to say some stuff that just doesn't end up being true, right? Don't hitch your wagon to stuff like that, right? You're going to get it wrong,
Right.
Just let it go, and just love. That's what the priesthood is necessary for. And it's a misapplication, it's a misuse of, and this is my opinion, of our authority and of our vocation when we hitch it to the wrong things, right? I had a wonderful parishioner. She she actually asked me, is it okay if I vote for this person? I was like, oh, bless your heart. Kind of gave the standard answer of, are you voting for this person for Christian reasons? And there's no way I would ever go there. And it's not because I worry about losing the 501c3, it's just, and for me as a pastor, that's also how I approach, these psychological issues, right? It's not about me figuring out, what's going on inside somebody's head. It's more of a way of being, and a demonstration, and like you said, being with someone in their pain, right? That's my job. And once weird stuff, that I'm like, I don't know about that, go see George. Right? Oh, well, thank you so much for your time today. And, you're just a fantastic resource, and what a blessing to have you at Boston University, and also doing this work, looking at how our priests are doing and how we can care for them better. I can't tell you how heartened I am that our church is interested enough to get the right people doing this kind of thing so the ministry becomes sustainable.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation to be with you. And I would say I'm grateful for those opportunities that you just described to be in that place. And I'll say that the church supported me in that every step of the way. I never received any feedback or resistance saying, what are you doing? Why do you want to do that? You went to the seminary, you should be a priest. That gets said once in a while. But the encouragement to go down this path was very much church supported.
Oh yeah, and we need this. We really do. And God bless you and all of your work. And you've got a new friend in Georgia.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. And you back here in snowy New England.
You can have the snow. I'll take the friendship.
You got it.
Until the next time, everybody, Godspeed.